The gun was already in Adelaide Keene's hand when Orville Easton walked through the door of the Silver Spur saloon, and the look on her face told him she was not entirely sure she would not use it. "You," she said, and the word came out like something she had been holding between her teeth for too long, something that had cut her on the way out. "You have exactly 30 seconds to tell me why I should not put a bullet through that letter before you read another word of it." The letter in question was on the table between them, its wax seal already broken, its contents already burned into Adelaide's memory like a brand on hide. She had not meant to read it. She had found it folded into the lining of her late husband's saddlebag 3 days after his burial, tucked behind a false seam so carefully constructed that she might never have found it if the bag's stitching had not split from grief and rough weather alike. The letter was addressed to a man in Santa Fe, a man named Colton Briggs, and its contents detailed with cold, businesslike precision how much Adelaide Keene was worth, not in the way a man speaks of a woman he loves, but in the way a man speaks of livestock he intends to sell. Orville did not reach for the letter. He did not reach for the colt at his own hip. He stood in the doorway of the Silver Spur with the late afternoon sun of redemption, New Mexico blazing behind him, turning him into a silhouette against the burning gold of 1882, and he said very quietly, "I already know what it says." The air went out of the room. Adelaide's hand tightened on the revolver. "Say that again." "I already know what it says, Adelaide. I have known for 4 months." He stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind him, and removed his hat with the kind of deliberate slowness a man uses when he wants to show he is not a threat. "I came here to stop it before it could happen again." "Before it could happen again," she repeated. Her voice was strange, high and thin and terrifyingly controlled, because Adelaide Keene had learned years ago that women who screamed were ignored, but women who went very, very quiet made men afraid. "My husband is 3 days in the ground. You are telling me that you knew he was selling me, that he had planned to sell me to some man in Santa Fe, and you waited until now to say a single word about it." "I waited," Orville said, "because I needed proof. And I waited because your husband, while he was alive, was not a man who took kindly to being confronted, and I had already watched what he did to the last person who confronted him." He set his hat on the edge of the bar. There was no bartender, no other soul in the Silver Spur at this hour. It was just the two of them and the dust and the secret and the gun. "I am not here to tell you what to do. I am not here to tell you what you are worth. I am here because there is a man riding from Santa Fe right now who does not know your husband is dead, and he is coming to collect." Adelaide lowered the gun, not because she trusted Orville Easton, not entirely, but because the logic of his words was colder and more frightening than her anger, and she needed both hands free to think. That had been 3 months ago. 3 months since the world cracked open beneath her feet and revealed the dark hollow underneath. What had happened between that moment and this one was a story Adelaide had not planned on living, and certainly had not planned on surviving, and absolutely had not planned on falling in love in the middle of. But here she was. She had come to Redemption, New Mexico in the spring of 1881, which was not where she had intended to go at all. She had intended to go to Denver. She had a cousin in Denver who ran a boarding house and who had written to say that there was always room, that Denver was growing, that a woman with Adelaide's particular talent for organization and her ability to manage accounts would find good work there. The letter had been warm and full of promise, and it had arrived 6 months too late, because by the time it reached Adelaide in Galveston, Texas, she had already married a man named Howard Keene. Howard Keene had presented himself as a man of prospects. He was not unhandsome, not unkind in the ways that were immediately obvious, and he had a confidence about him that Adelaide, who had been managing her sick father's affairs since the age of 16, and who had been doing it alone since her father's death when she was 22, found genuinely persuasive. He spoke about his ranch outside Redemption the way prophets spoke about promised lands, and Adelaide, who was 24 and tired and a little afraid of what her life was becoming, had believed him. The ranch existed. That much was true. It was a modest operation, cattle mostly, with a small house that was better built than it looked from the outside, and a bunkhouse where 2 hired hands lived during the seasons they were needed. Redemption itself was a town of perhaps 400 souls, the kind of town that had a general store, a church, a saloon, a blacksmith, a doctor who was also the town's only dentist, and enough daily drama to keep a person occupied if they were inclined toward involvement in other people's business. Adelaide was not particularly inclined toward that. She kept the house, managed the household accounts, raised a modest kitchen garden, and attended church on Sundays in the way that was expected of a ranch wife in a small town in New Mexico Territory in 1881. She was not unhappy in the way that announces itself loudly. She was unhappy in the way of a person who has made a practical decision and is now living inside it and discovering that practicality does not, by itself, constitute a life. It was at church that she first noticed Orville Easton, and she noticed him mainly because he was hard to miss. He was not the tallest man in Redemption, but he was built in a way that suggested he had been designed for purpose rather than aesthetics, broad through the shoulders, with hands that had clearly been working since they were old enough to hold something. He had a face that was not classically handsome, but was tremendously interesting, the kind of face that told a story, with a jaw that looked like it had been set against something difficult for a very long time, and a pair of gray eyes that gave nothing away unless he decided to give something, and then they gave everything all at once. He was, Adelaide would later learn, 29 years old in the summer of 1881, which made him 5 years her senior, and gave him no particular advantage in experience that she could identify, except perhaps in the ways that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with character. He was the county's deputy sheriff, a position he held with a quietness that was itself a kind of authority. The sheriff of Redemption County was a man named Garrett Holt, who was competent and liked, and not particularly concerned with the fine-grained workings of the territory beyond his own jurisdiction. Orville, by contrast, seemed to notice everything. He noticed when the Miller boy was taking too much at cards. He noticed when the water in the north pasture was not running right because of something upstream. He noticed when the woman in the third pew from the left, the ranch wife of Adelaide Keene, was sitting with her shoulders pulled in just a fraction too tight. Adelaide did not know he had noticed. She was far too busy not noticing him. This went on for several months, through the summer and into the early autumn of 1881, during which time Adelaide's marriage continued its quiet, practical trajectory, and Adelaide Keene continued to be the kind of husband who was present without being particularly there. He was away frequently on what he described as business trips to Albuquerque, and Adelaide, who managed his accounts well enough to know that the business trips were not generating any discernible revenue, began to develop a careful, private worry that she kept tucked away behind her daily tasks. She was not a woman who was easily frightened. She had buried her father alone, managed an estate that was mostly debt, found herself a husband in a new territory, and built a functioning household from near nothing. Fear was not an emotion Adelaide Keene gave much house room to because she had learned that it did not pay rent, but worry she allowed. Worry was useful. Worry made her pay attention. She began paying attention in October of 1881 when she found the first discrepancy in Howard's accounts. A sum had been received from a source she did not recognize, not from cattle sales, not from any legitimate operation of the ranch, but from an entity identified only by initials in Howard's cramped handwriting. She noted it, said nothing, and continued paying attention. By December, there were 3 more such entries. She did not know yet what they meant. She did not know yet what Howard was involved in. She knew only that something was wrong in the way that a person knows when a floorboard is not quite right, not from the sight of it but from the feel, the slight give underfoot that tells you the foundation is uncertain. Howard Keene died on a Tuesday in February of 1882, which was not, as the official report stated, the result of a fall from his horse. Adelaide knew it was not a fall. She had seen the look on his face in the hours before it happened, the particular tightness around his eyes that was not pain but fear, and she had noticed the stranger who rode into town that evening and left before morning, without stopping at the hotel or the saloon or anywhere a traveler would naturally stop. But she was a woman alone in a territory where justice was shaped primarily by men, and she had no proof, and the sheriff had signed the certificate, and so Howard Keene was buried as a man who fell from his horse. 3 days later, she found the letter. In the 6 months preceding his death, Howard Keene had been engaged in a scheme that Adelaide, once she understood its full dimensions, recognized as both more desperate and more calculated than she had given him credit for. The ranch was mortgaged past recovery. His cattle operation had been underwater since the previous spring. The money she had been seeing in the accounts was not from legitimate business, but from a series of arrangements with a man named Colton Briggs in Santa Fe, a man who dealt in things that were not spoken about openly, including, as Adelaide now understood with a cold and particular horror, women. Howard had arranged, in writing, to deliver his wife to Colton Briggs in exchange for the forgiveness of a substantial debt. The letter laid it out with the dispassion of a business transaction because, to Howard Keene, that was precisely what it was. Adelaide was the asset he had left that was worth anything, and he had sold her in advance without her knowledge, without her consent, and without the slightest apparent consideration for the fact that she was a human being with a mind and a will and enough anger inside her to burn the whole territory down if properly motivated. She had been properly motivated. But anger alone was not a plan, and Adelaide Keene had always understood the difference between an emotion and a strategy. She had the letter. She had 3 days before Colton Briggs's man was due to arrive based on the timeline in the correspondence, and she had approximately nobody in Redemption she trusted well enough to tell. And then Orville Easton had walked through the door of the Silver Spur. She had gone there because she needed to think and could not think inside the house that was no longer hers and might never have been, and the saloon was empty at that hour, and she had brought the revolver because she was not a fool. "How do you know about Colton Briggs?" she asked him, once the gun was at her side and she was sitting at the table across from him, her hands flat on the wood to keep them from shaking with fury rather than fear. "Because I have been building a case against him for 8 months, Orville said. He sat across from her without asking permission, which she appreciated because asking permission would have felt like a performance. He operates out of Santa Fe, but his operations run through at least 4 territories. Women mostly, but also land schemes, extortion. He is careful and he is well connected, and every time I have gotten close enough to touch him, something slips away." He looked at her steadily. "Your husband came onto my radar about 6 months ago. When I understood the nature of the arrangement he had made, I tried to find a way to warn you without tipping Howard off. A man who knew he was being watched might have moved the timetable." "And if he had moved the timetable," Adelaide said slowly, "what would have happened to me?" "Nothing good," Orville said. "I know that is not a satisfying answer. I am sorry for it." She studied him. He did not look away, which she found she respected, because many men looked away when she looked at them directly for too long. It was as though the directness of a woman's gaze was something they had not accounted for. "You said a man is coming from Santa Fe," she said. "He will be here by Friday at the latest. His name is Whitmore, he works for Briggs, and he is not the kind of man who responds well to disappointment." "Then we have until Friday," Adelaide said. Orville looked at her with those gray eyes that gave everything all at once when they decided to. "What do you mean, we?" "You have been building a case against Colton Briggs for 8 months, she said. "And I have the letter that proves the transaction, signed in my late husband's handwriting, that connects Briggs directly to a criminal conspiracy involving the unlawful disposition of a person. She tilted her head slightly. I believe that makes us useful to each other, Deputy Easton. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You should not have to be in the middle of this. You are already in the middle of this." "I know," she said. "I was put there without my knowledge or consent. I would like, at minimum, to be involved in how I get out." He nodded, just that. One slow nod that communicated something she did not quite have a name for yet, something between respect and recognition, the way you look at a person when you realize you have been underestimating what they are made of. "All right," he said. "Then we have until Friday." They worked through that first night in the empty saloon, the oil lamp burning low between them, the letter at the center of the table like a piece of evidence at a trial. Adelaide had already memorized its contents, but she went through it again with Orville systematically, identifying every name, every date, every implied connection. He had a notebook that he used with the efficiency of a man accustomed to building cases from fragments, and he wrote quickly, his handwriting surprisingly clean for a man with working hands. She told him about the account discrepancies she had found, the initials in Howard's ledger, the dates that correlated with things she now understood to be payments from Briggs. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual enough to be noticeable. When she finished, he laid out what he knew from his end, carefully, including details about Briggs's operation that turned her stomach and made her very grateful that Howard Keene was already dead, because if he had not been, she thought she might have been tempted to correct the situation herself. Around 2 in the morning, the saloon door opened and a man named Jenkins, who was one of the night riders employed by a neighboring ranch, stuck his head in, took one look at the two of them at the table, said, "Beg pardon, ma'am, deputy," and left without explanation. Adelaide looked at Orville. "By morning," she said, "the entire town will know that the widow Keene spent the night in the Silver Spur with the deputy sheriff." "Does that concern you?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Less than it should," she said, "given what else I have to worry about." He almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, more the implication of one, the way a door opens just slightly before you decide whether to go through. "I can get a message to Sheriff Holt before morning. He needs to know Whitmore is coming, and we will need his authority to hold Whitmore for questioning when he arrives." "Will Holt cooperate?" "Garrett Holt is a good man," Orville said without hesitation. "He will cooperate." He was right about that. When they sat down with Holt the following morning in the sheriff's office, Adelaide presenting the letter with a steadiness in her hands that she was rather proud of, Garrett Holt read it twice, said something under his breath that was not suitable for polite company, and immediately began making preparations. The plan they arrived at was direct. When Whitmore arrived in Redemption looking for Howard Keene's wife, he would find the sheriff's office instead. The letter, along with Adelaide's testimony about the account entries and the corroborating evidence Orville had built over 8 months, would be enough to hold him and to begin building a case against Briggs that could be forwarded to the territorial marshal. It was not a perfect plan. Plans that involved men who worked for dangerous people were rarely perfect. But it was the best available option, and Adelaide, who had been living in imperfect options since well before she married Howard Keene, was comfortable with that. What she was not comfortable with was the afternoon of Thursday, which arrived with a deceptive calm that should have warned her, and during which she spent 6 hours going through the rest of Howard's papers in the ranch house in an attempt to find anything else that might be relevant, and discovered, tucked into the false bottom of a desk drawer, a second letter. This one was not to Colton Briggs. This one was from Colton Briggs, and it was written in the weeks after Howard's death, and it was addressed to whoever had the misfortune of being found in possession of the property, and it laid out with that same cold, businesslike precision the terms under which the debt would now be collected. The property, as Briggs described it, now included the land. Adelaide sat with the letter in the late afternoon light of the ranch house kitchen and understood, in a way that settled into her bones like winter, that she had been wrong about how much she had to lose. She had believed in the pragmatic section of her heart that she was managing a threat to her freedom, her safety, perhaps her dignity. She had not understood until this moment that the threat extended to every acre of land that Howard Keene had left behind, mortgaged and underwater, and now claimed by a criminal enterprise as collateral. She had nowhere to go. She had no money that was not tied to the ranch. Her cousin in Denver was a warm letter 2 years old. She was 25 years old in February of 1882, in a territory that offered women very limited legal standing in property disputes, a widow whose legal relationship to the land she stood on was already precarious. She rode to the sheriff's office with the second letter, and she did not let herself feel the fear that was walking alongside her like a shadow because she needed both hands free to think, and she had always been better at thinking than feeling, or at least better at pretending she was. Orville was there when she arrived. He was always there, she was beginning to notice, not in a way that felt like surveillance or constraint, but in a way that felt like reliability, which was something Adelaide had very little experience with in men, and found herself responding to with a wariness she recognized as self-protective. He read the second letter. His jaw tightened. "This changes things," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "This makes you a target beyond the immediate situation with Whitmore. Even if we hold Whitmore and build the case against Briggs, if Briggs believes he has a legal claim to the land through the debt arrangement, then I need to fight it on 2 fronts," Adelaide said. "The immediate physical threat and the legal claim." "You need a lawyer," Orville said. "I need a lawyer who is willing to take on a case against a powerful criminal in Santa Fe on behalf of a woman with no current income and a ranch that is more debt than value," Adelaide said. "Those are not especially common." Orville was quiet. Then he said, "There is a man in Albuquerque. His name is Theodaz Park. He is a good lawyer and he has dealt with Briggs's operations before peripherally through other cases. He owes me a conversation." "Does he owe you a conversation?" Adelaide said carefully. "Or does he owe you a favor?" The almost smile again. "Both." She looked at him across the sheriff's desk, in the orange light of the afternoon coming through the single window, with both letters on the wood between them and the entirety of her situation laid out with brutal clarity, and she said something she had not planned to say, because Adelaide Keene was not in the habit of saying things she had not planned. "Why are you helping me?" He did not answer immediately. He picked up the letters and aligned their edges carefully, the way a person handles something they want to treat with respect. Then he looked at her. "Because someone should have helped you before any of this happened," he said, "and they did not. And I knew something was wrong and I did not act fast enough. That is on me, Adelaide." It was the first time he had used her first name. She noticed. She put it away to look at later when she had time for noticing personal things. Whitmore arrived on Friday morning at 10 o'clock, riding a chestnut mare, and wearing the particular expression of a man accustomed to delivering news that other people did not want to hear. He rode to the ranch first, found it empty, and then came into town and made the mistake of asking the wrong person where the widow Keene could be found. The wrong person was Mrs. Hatch from the Mercantile, who was both a churchgoer and deeply principled, and who sent Whitmore to the sheriff's office with the serene confidence of a woman who believed in justice. He was in custody within 20 minutes of arriving in Redemption. He was not easily persuaded to talk. Men who worked for Colton Briggs were not, as a rule, easily persuaded of anything, because the consequences of cooperation with law enforcement were considerably more unpleasant than the consequences of a night in a territorial jail. But Orville Easton was patient in the way of a man who had been building cases in pieces for years and understood that patience was often the most powerful tool available, and over the course of 2 days, he dismantled Whitmore's silence with the careful, relentless precision of a man taking apart a clock. Whitmore gave them enough. Not everything, but enough. Enough to send to the territorial marshal in Santa Fe. Enough to begin the formal legal process against Briggs's operation. Enough to establish Adelaide's letter as a central piece of evidence in a criminal matter rather than simply a private wrong. Adelaide was present for none of Whitmore's interrogations. She was at the ranch, going through Howard's papers with the systematic thoroughness of a woman who had decided that if she was going to fight this war, she was going to know every piece of ground she was standing on. She cataloged everything, organized it into a set of documents she could present to a lawyer, and was halfway through the second trunk of papers when she found, between the pages of an old farmer's almanac, a deed. Not the deed to the ranch, something else. A deed to a small piece of land on the edge of town that was in Adelaide's name, her name only, not Howard's, with a notarization date that was 2 weeks before their wedding. She sat down on the floor of the ranch house bedroom and read it 3 times. Howard had purchased a piece of land in her name before they were married. Small, worth perhaps $200 at most, but hers legally and entirely, untouched by Howard's debts or Briggs's claims, because it had been hers before the marriage and in her name alone throughout. Whether Howard had intended it as a genuine gift or as some practical maneuver she could not now determine, but the result was the same. She had a legal foothold. She had something that was hers. She rode to the sheriff's office at a gallop and was slightly out of breath when she came through the door, which was unusual enough for Adelaide, who generally entered rooms at her own pace, that both Sheriff Holt and Orville turned to look at her immediately. She put the deed on the desk. Orville looked at it. He looked at her, the almost smile became something more. "This is a foundation," he said. "I know," she said. She was still breathing harder than she liked. "I know what I can build on it." She could not build much on it immediately, but she could build the principle of it. And in legal terms, as Theodaz Park confirmed when he arrived from Albuquerque 10 days later, a tall, spare man with ink-stained fingers and sharp eyes who turned out to be both competent and fiercely motivated by the opportunity to put Colton Briggs's financial arrangements under legal scrutiny. The foundation was everything. Theodaz Park worked on Adelaide's case with what she could only describe as evangelical enthusiasm. He established that the ranch debt, while real, was partially fraudulent in its construction, that Briggs had manipulated Howard into terms that were designed to guarantee default, and that the arrangement detailed in the letter constituted multiple violations of federal statutes regarding criminal conspiracy. The case against Briggs was forwarded to the United States Marshal's office, and while Briggs himself was a man who had survived scrutiny before and was already making arrangements to become difficult to find, the legal machinery set in motion that spring would catch up with him eventually. More immediately relevant to Adelaide's daily survival was the question of what to do about the ranch. The ranch was sold. She did not fight this. The proceeds went to the creditors and left her with very little, but they also left her with no debt, which was worth more than the buildings and the land that had carried it. She kept the small piece of land on the edge of town, and she moved into 2 rooms above the general store that she rented from Hester Vale, who ran the store and who was, Adelaide discovered, one of those people in small communities who knows everything about everyone and has chosen to use this power exclusively for good. She found work teaching school. Redemption had a 1-room schoolhouse that had been without a permanent teacher since the previous autumn, and Adelaide, who had been educated well enough by a father who believed that a sharp mind was the only inheritance worth leaving, was more than competent to fill the role. The school board, which consisted of 3 ranchers and the church deacon, were initially hesitant about the widow Keene, but they were also desperate, and desperation frequently overcomes hesitation in practical matters. She began teaching in April of 1882, and she was good at it. She was firm and fair and genuinely interested in the question of how minds worked, and the children of redemption responded to this with the particular directness that children use when they recognize an adult who is actually paying attention to them. She was 25 years old, and she was starting over from nothing, and she was more herself than she had been in 2 years of marriage, which was something she noticed but did not yet know what to do with. Orville came to see her twice during those first weeks of April, both times on official pretexts that they both recognized as pretexts without acknowledging this. The first time was to report on the status of the Briggs case, which was the kind of update she could have received at the sheriff's office. The second time was to return a book she had left accidentally in the sheriff's office 2 weeks prior, which was plausible except that she had not been in the sheriff's office in 2 weeks, and the book had almost certainly been in someone's pocket rather than on a desk. She did not point these things out. She noticed them, in the way she was beginning to notice things about Orville Easton with a frequency and attention that she recognized as distinct from the way she noticed other people. She noticed that he was careful with words in a way that was not evasiveness but precision, as though he had learned somewhere along the way that words cost something and should be spent accordingly. She noticed that he took his coffee black, and that he was courteous to Hester Vale in a way that was genuine rather than performative. She noticed that he was good with the children she taught, the few times she saw him near the schoolhouse, easy and unaffected in a way some grown men were not comfortable being with children. She noticed that the almost smile appeared most reliably when she said something that surprised him, which happened with satisfying frequency, because Adelaide Keene had opinions and expressed them without apology. She was not looking to fall in love. She had been married and she had been disappointed in marriage, and she had arrived at a place in herself that was independent and functional and cautious in the way of someone who has put their weight on a floor and had it give way. She was not interested in another floor that might give way. But the particular problem with Orville Easton was that he did not seem to be presenting himself as a floor to stand on. He was not presenting himself as anything. He showed up when he was useful. He said what he meant and did what he said. He helped her because helping her was right, and not because he expected anything from it. This was so different from her experience of how men in her life had operated that she found it deeply disorienting, and she spent rather a lot of April and early May being disoriented in a way she did not quite understand. The understanding arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in late May, when she was locking up the schoolhouse and Orville was coming down the street on his horse, and he stopped because he always stopped when he saw her, just to say a word or two, nothing that required stopping really, but he always stopped, and she looked up at him against the afternoon sky and felt something shift in her chest with a clarity that was almost alarming. She was falling in love with this man. She had been falling for some time without noticing, because she had been so focused on not noticing that the not noticing had become its own kind of noticing. She locked the schoolhouse door and walked home with this knowledge sitting quietly in her chest, and did not say a word about it to anyone, including herself. Orville came to the schoolhouse on a Friday at the end of May, not during school hours, not on any pretext she could identify, but simply in the early evening when she was cleaning the chalkboard and the last of the spring light was coming through the windows sideways and making the dust motes visible, and he stood in the doorway the way he had stood in the saloon 3 months ago, except without the silhouette and without the urgency. "I was wondering," he said, "if you would like to walk with me a while." She kept cleaning the chalkboard. "Where?" "I thought we could walk down to the river. It is pleasant in the evenings." She put down her eraser. "Deputy Easton." "Orville," he said. She turned to look at him. "Orville, what are you doing?" He looked back at her with those gray eyes that gave everything when they decided to. "I am asking you to take a walk," he said. "I know that you are not looking for anything. I know that you have had a profoundly difficult year, and that your situation is still uncertain, and that the last thing you need is someone making assumptions about what you want or need from another person. I am not making any assumptions." He paused. "I'm just asking you to walk with me." "You are just asking me to walk with you," she repeated. "Yes." She took off her apron and hung it on the hook by the door and picked up her shawl from the chair where she had left it. "Then let us walk," she said. The river was a quarter-mile from the edge of town, a broad, shallow stretch that moved quietly in late spring, warm enough in the shallows that the cottonwood trees along its banks were fully leaved and dense with shadow. They walked along it without hurrying, and the conversation they had was the kind that accumulates slowly into something significant, the way water erodes stone, not through force but through persistent contact. She told him about her father, who had been a meticulous man who kept his accounts in an elaborate system of his own devising, and who had believed that the best thing he could teach his daughter was how to understand what things actually cost. She told him about Galveston, which she had loved for its smell of salt and possibility, and which she had left with more relief than she had expected when Howard Keene had pointed her toward New Mexico and a future that had turned out to be something other than what was advertised. He told her about Texas, where he had grown up, and about coming to New Mexico territory as a young man of 22 with the particular combination of idealism and stubbornness that leads some people into law enforcement and others into trouble. He had been a deputy for 7 years and had discovered that what he was best at was the slow, careful work of building truth from evidence, which was not the flashy part of the job that made men into legends, but was the part he cared about most. He told her about Colton Briggs, not the case details she already knew, but the reason he had taken it personally. A woman he had known years ago, not a romantic attachment but a neighbor, someone he had grown up alongside, had been caught up in a scheme similar to the one that had threatened Adelaide. She had not been as lucky as Adelaide. By the time Orville understood what had happened, there was nothing he could do except make sure he understood how these operations worked well enough to stop the next one. Adelaide listened to this without saying anything for a while. Then she said, "That is why you already knew. When you walked into the Silver Spur, yes. You had been watching Howard not because of the cattle operation or the financial irregularities, but because you recognized Briggs's signature in what he was doing." "Yes." She was quiet again. The river moved. "You should have told me sooner," she said. "Yes," he said. "I should have. I was wrong not to." She looked at him sideways. "I appreciate that you said that without qualifying it. I try not to qualify my mistakes. It makes them sound smaller than they are." They walked back to town in the warm blue dusk, and he left her at the stairs to her rooms above the general store with a politeness that was somehow different from distance. And she went upstairs and sat at the small table by the window and held the whole evening in her mind for a while before she went to sleep. The summer of 1882 was the summer Adelaide Keene remade herself, and it was also, without quite meaning to be, the summer she fell in love with Orville Easton in a way that was complete and deliberate, and all the more certain for being slow. They had dinner twice in June, at the hotel dining room, which was the kind of place where you had to pretend you had not noticed everyone noticing you. Mrs. Hatch told Adelaide, with the directness of a woman who considers candor a courtesy, that the whole town was of the opinion that Adelaide and Deputy Easton were well suited, and Adelaide, who was becoming increasingly inclined to agree, said nothing, but did not deny it either. They rode out to the land she owned on a Sunday afternoon in July, the two of them on horseback in the dry summer heat, and she showed him the small, rocky piece of territory that was legally and entirely hers and talked about what she thought she might do with it. "I was thinking," she said, "about a schoolhouse." He looked at the land, then at her. "You want to build a school. The one in town is rented from the church and the arrangement is not guaranteed. If I had a permanent building on my own land, the school board would have to negotiate with me rather than the other way around." She shielded her eyes against the sun. "I know it is not a conventional use of the property. It would not generate income directly. It would generate stability," Orville said, "and it would give you something that is entirely yours. Both of those things seem valuable." "They do," she said. He said, "I know a builder in town who owes me a conversation." She looked at him. You have a lot of people who owe you conversations." "I am very conversational," he said, and this time the almost smile became a real one, and it transformed his face in a way that Adelaide had not been prepared for, that broad, genuine, unguarded smile that made him look younger and more open and entirely too appealing for her peace of mind. She laughed. It surprised her. Adelaide was not particularly in the habit of laughing, not because she lacked humor, but because she had spent a long time in situations where nothing was very funny. The laugh that came out of her on that Sunday afternoon in July, standing on her own land in the New Mexico heat, was not the polite, managed laugh she had learned for social occasions, but something real that came up from somewhere deeper than her careful, organized mind. Orville looked at her when she laughed, and the look on his face was the same as the moment in the sheriff's office when she had laid out the second letter, that specific quality of attention that felt like being seen rather than looked at. And she understood in that moment that she was not falling toward something uncertain. She had already arrived. She did not say anything about any of this. But on the ride back to town, when they were side by side on the horses, and the evening was coming on, and the distant mountains were turning purple, and the whole territory stretched out around them in the particular grandeur that had always made her feel both very small and very alive, she said, "Orville, Adelaide, I appreciate you," she said. "I want you to know that, whatever this is, I appreciate that you are in it with me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know you are not asking me to be anything. But I want to be anyway." She looked at him. "I know your situation is uncertain," he said. "I know you are still in the middle of all of it. I know you are not asking for anyone to step in or make promises or complicate things further. I'm not trying to step in or make promises. I just want you to know that I am here." He paused. "I want to be here, not because it is useful or because it is right or because I feel responsible for the situation, because I want to be." The horses walked on, and the mountains turned darker purple, and Adelaide Keene did something she had not done in a very long time. She reached across the space between the horses and put her hand over his where it rested on the saddle, briefly, just for a moment, just enough to say yes. The case against Colton Briggs moved through the summer with the slow, grinding momentum of federal machinery. Theodaz Park was back in Albuquerque, working the legal angle with the territorial marshal's office, and Orville was in regular correspondence with the marshal himself, a man named Felix Drummond who had a personal interest in shutting down Briggs's operation, as he had been trying to do so for the better part of 3 years. In August, Briggs made the mistake of overcorrecting. He sent 2 men to Redemption, not to collect or to threaten in any direct way, but to make the kind of ambient presence that was intended to remind Adelaide and Orville that he existed and had reach and was not pleased about the ongoing attention. The 2 men rode in on a Thursday, took rooms at the hotel, ate at the hotel dining room, and spent 2 days being visible. Orville watched them. He did not confront them directly, because they had done nothing that was legally actionable, and because the last thing the case needed was a provocation that Briggs could turn around. He documented their presence, noted their movements, sent a telegram to the marshal's office, and told Adelaide matter-of-factly what was happening. Adelaide did not pretend she was not frightened. She had gotten better at acknowledging when she was frightened, which was itself a kind of progress, but she did not change anything about her daily life. She went to the schoolhouse in the morning and came home in the evening, and stopped at Hester Vale's store for what she needed, and went to church on Sunday, and conducted herself with a dignity that was not the absence of fear, but the presence of something stronger. On the 3rd day, the 2 men rode out of Redemption without incident, and Orville let out a breath that he had been holding for approximately 72 hours. He came to find Adelaide that evening, not officially, not as the deputy, but simply as himself. He knocked on the door at the top of the stairs above the general store, and she opened it, and she was in her house clothes rather than her school clothes, and her dark hair was down rather than pinned, which was the first time he had seen it down, and he stood there for a moment doing the thing where his face did not give anything away until it gave everything. "They have gone," he said. "I know," she said. "I heard the horses." She stood back from the door, and he came in, and she put on the small iron stove to make coffee, and they sat at her little table by the window and talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with Briggs or the case or the fragility of her legal situation. They talked about books, because it turned out Orville read extensively, which surprised her and probably should not have. They talked about what she found in teaching, the specific satisfaction of watching a child understand something for the first time. They talked about the territory and what it might become when it was a state, which was a question of considerable public debate in 1882. At some point, the conversation stopped being about anything in particular and became something else, the kind of quiet that is not empty but full, the comfortable weight of two people who have moved through enough difficulty together that silence between them is not awkward but companionable. It was Adelaide who said, finally, "I am not as afraid as I was." He looked at her across the table. "That is good. Some of that is the situation improving," she said, "and some of it is you." He did not say anything for a moment. The lamp was low and the town outside the window was quiet, and she could see the mountains at the edge of the dark sky. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask it." "I want to ask you to supper," he said. "Not at the hotel dining room where everyone can watch. Somewhere private. I want to cook for you." She raised an eyebrow. "You cook?" "I am very competent," he said, "at a small number of things." "All right," she said. "Ask me." "Adelaide Keene," he said, "would you have supper with me?" "Yes," she said, "I would." Supper turned out to be at his small house on the edge of town, which was where he lived alone, and where he cooked a beef stew that was unpretentious and genuinely excellent. And Adelaide sat at his kitchen table and ate it, and thought that she had been in this territory for over a year and a half, and this was the first time she had felt fully comfortable in a room. After supper, they sat on the narrow porch and looked at the stars, which were extravagant in the way that stars in New Mexico in September are extravagant, as though the sky is showing off. The temperature had dropped in the way that September evenings do in high desert, and she had her shawl around her shoulders and he was in his shirt sleeves, and the closeness was natural rather than calculated, two people who have arrived at the same place from very different directions. He took her hand, just held it, her hand in his on the arm of the chair, easy and certain. She turned her head to look at him. "I meant what I said in July," he said. "On the ride back from your land, I want to be in this. Whatever it means for your situation, whatever you need it to be. I am not asking you to define it or commit to anything you are not ready for." "And if I am ready," she said. He looked at her with the full weight of those gray eyes. "Then I am here." "Orville," she said, and his name in her voice had a quality she could feel, something that had been building since February and was now as clear as anything she had ever known. "I have been managing everything alone for a very long time, not because I preferred it, but because that was what was available to me, and I am good at it. I will always be good at it, but I do not want to keep doing it alone if I do not have to." "You do not have to," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his other arm around her, careful and sure. They sat like that under the extravagant September stars while redemption slept around them, and the case against Colton Briggs worked its slow machinery through the territorial justice system, and the school on her land was 3 weeks from breaking ground, and her life, which had been broken apart and put back differently, was revealing itself to be something she had not expected, something better. In November of 1882, Colton Briggs was arrested in El Paso, Texas, where he had gone apparently believing that the Rio Grande offered some kind of protection from the consequences accumulating in New Mexico territory. It did not. Marshal Felix Drummond, with Theodaz Park and Orville's 8 months of documentation, and Adelaide's letters and testimony, all contributing to what Drummond described in his official report as one of the most airtight cases he had seen, brought charges that included criminal conspiracy, fraud, and violations of federal statutes that made the depth and breadth of Briggs's operation impossible to minimize or dismiss. Adelaide read the telegram from Theodaz Park in November in the sheriff's office, standing next to Orville, and she felt something she had not expected, not triumph exactly, but a release, the giving way of something she had been bracing against for months, some tight interior structure that she had built to hold herself together through the worst of it and that she could now, cautiously and gratefully, allow to soften. She turned to Orville and he was already looking at her. "It is over," she said. "The Briggs part," he said, "yes. And the rest of it, he said, is just life, which continues to require managing." She laughed, that real laugh that came up from somewhere deep. "That is either very reassuring or very daunting." "Probably both," he said. Sheriff Garrett Holt, who was at his desk attempting to look as though he had not been listening to every word of this exchange, cleared his throat. "I would like the record to show," he said, "that I have demonstrated extraordinary professionalism and restraint throughout this entire year." "Noted," Orville and Adelaide said at the same time, and then looked at each other, and the moment had a warmth in it that was simple and uncomplicated and entirely good. The schoolhouse on Adelaide's land broke ground in November and was built by January, a modest, well-constructed building with good light from the southern windows and a proper door, and a wood stove that actually drew. The school board, recognizing that the ground had shifted, and that Adelaide Keene was neither a woman in need of charity nor one who would be managed by committee, renegotiated her contract on terms considerably more favorable to her. She was the owner of the building, the lessor of the school, and the permanent teacher of record, which gave her a stability she had not had since her father was alive. December arrived cold and clear, and Adelaide spent Christmas for the first time in a long time in the company of people she had chosen rather than people she had inherited. Hester Vale hosted a dinner on Christmas Eve with a small gathering that included the Holts, old Mrs. Crane, who ran the church's sewing circle, and Orville, and it was the most ordinary and satisfying evening Adelaide could remember, the kind of warmth that comes not from grand occasions, but from the small, accumulated rightness of being in a place where you belong. After the dinner, she and Orville walked back through the cold town together, their breath visible in the air, the stars ferocious again overhead, and he stopped at the bottom of her stairs and took her face in both his hands in the cold December air and kissed her for the first time. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a man who has been certain for a long time and is finally saying so, warm and deliberate and entirely real. And Adelaide, who had been managing everything alone for a very long time, put her hands against his chest and kissed him back and felt the tight interior structure, the last of it, dissolve completely. "Adelaide," he said when he stepped back enough to look at her. "I know," she said. Her voice was steady, her eyes were bright. "I know." He proposed in February, exactly 1 year after she had found the letter in the saddlebag and the whole desperate year had begun. He did it quietly, without audience, at the schoolhouse after the last child had gone home for the day, while she was banking the fire in the wood stove. He came in through the door and stood in the familiar way, hat in his hands, and she turned and looked at him, and something in his face told her before he said a word. "Adelaide," he said. "Orville," she said. "I know you have built everything you have from the ground up," he said. "I know that your land and your school and your independence are yours and they belong to you in ways that have nothing to do with me. I am not asking to change any of that." He paused. "I am asking if you would be willing to let me be beside you, permanently." She crossed the room to him. She took his hat out of his hands and set it on the nearest desk, which happened to be the one belonging to young William Perry, who was 9 and excellent at arithmetic. Then she looked up at Orville Easton, who was patient and certain and real and who had walked into a saloon in February of the worst year of her life and said he already knew and who had meant every word he had ever said to her. "Yes," she said, "with the understanding that it is beside me and not in front of me." "I would not know how to do it any other way," he said. she believed him. They were married in April of 1883, on a Saturday morning at the church in Redemption, in a ceremony that was not small because the entire town had evidently decided that the wedding of the schoolteacher and the deputy sheriff was a community occasion, whether or not they had been specifically invited. Sheriff Holt stood up for Orville. Hester Vale stood up for Adelaide. Theodaz Park rode out from Albuquerque for it, which Adelaide took as a mark of his good character. Mrs. Hatch from the Mercantile cried in the front pew, which she denied afterward. Adelaide wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself, because making it herself meant it fit exactly right and looked exactly as she had wanted it to look, which was elegant without pretension, which was how she had always thought a person ought to look if they had the option. She walked into the church alone because she wanted to, because she was a woman arriving at a choice she had made with full awareness of what she was choosing, and she did not need to be delivered by anyone. She arrived at the front of the church and looked at Orville, and his face did the thing, the full thing, the giving of everything, and she thought she had never seen anything so clear and true in her life. The ceremony was short and the words were direct, and when it was done, Garrett Holt led the congregation in a cheer that Adelaide would have found embarrassing at almost any other point in her life but found, in the moment, entirely correct. Life in Redemption after the wedding settled into a shape that was comfortable without being comfortable in the way of complacency. Adelaide ran the school and Orville kept the peace, and they shared his house, which they extended by a room that spring because Adelaide had a great many books and they needed somewhere to put them. She planted a proper garden, not just vegetables but flowers, because she had decided that now she had a permanent home she was going to have flowers in it. And Orville, who had no particular feelings about flowers either way, found himself unexpectedly pleased by the hollyhocks along the fence. Marshall Drummond passed through Redemption in the summer of 1883, on his way back from Las Cruces, and stopped for 2 days, during which he and Orville discussed the territorial lawman situation with the kind of directness that suggested there was a specific opportunity being navigated. Adelaide observed this from a careful distance and waited. Orville came home on the second evening of Drummond's visit and found her in the garden in the late light, and told her that Drummond had offered him the position of Deputy Territorial Marshal, based in Albuquerque, with jurisdiction across the territory and considerably expanded authority. It was a significant position. It was the kind of position that Orville was genuinely suited for, which Adelaide had understood for some time. It was also in Albuquerque, which was a 2-day ride from Redemption. She sat down on the garden bench and he sat beside her. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to know what you think," he said. "That is not the same question." "No," he said, "but they are related." She looked at the hollyhocks. "Albuquerque is a larger city than Redemption. It has more schools. It has more children who need teaching." He looked at her. "Adelaide, I am not going to be the reason you do not take a position you have earned," she said. "That is not a role I have any interest in playing. But I will be honest with you." She turned to look at him. "I love Redemption. I built something here. The school is mine in ways that matter, and I would not walk away from it without knowing that what we go to is worth what we leave." "The school would not have to close," he said carefully. "If it is on your land with your contract, you could appoint a qualified teacher and retain ownership. You would still have it, you would just have it differently." She was quiet, thinking. "And Albuquerque?" "Albuquerque has an excellent school system," he said. "And if you wanted to build something there as you built something here, I would stand beside you while you did it. Beside, not in front." She looked at him. He had remembered exactly what she had said on the day she said yes. She thought that was worth something significant. "I will need to find the right teacher," she said. He took her hand. "Take as long as you need." She found the right teacher in September of 1883, a young woman named Clara Finch, who had trained as a teacher in Chicago and had come west with her family, and who had a quality in her interactions with the redemption children that Adelaide recognized as genuine vocation. She spent 2 months working alongside Clara, transferring everything about the school's particular culture and methods, and left it in October with the sense that it would be all right. They moved to Albuquerque in November of 1883, in a wagon loaded with Adelaide's books, the kitchen equipment she had accumulated, the seeds she had saved from the redemption garden, and the particular quiet confidence of two people who know exactly who they are going toward and why. Albuquerque in 1883 was a city of several thousand people, considerably more complex and noisy than Redemption, with its own intricate social landscape and its own set of opportunities and complications. Adelaide found a way to inhabit it that was characteristically her own, not by trying to become part of the existing social structures immediately, but by identifying what was needed and building something to meet it. She discovered that there was a gap in educational provision for children in the newer neighborhoods on the city's eastern edge, families who had arrived too recently to have children settled into the existing school system. She negotiated, organized, persuaded, and within 18 months had established a second school in those neighborhoods, funded through a combination of a small territorial education grant and a contribution from a civic organization that Theodaz Park had pointed her toward. Orville, as the deputy territorial marshal, was good in ways that went beyond the merely competent. He was exactly the person Drummond had assessed him to be, someone who understood that justice was built slowly and carefully, and that the most important work was often the least visible. He was away from home more than he had been as a deputy in Redemption, and this was a thing that they navigated together, sometimes imperfectly, always honestly. Adelaide became pregnant in the spring of 1884. She was 27 years old and in good health, and she regarded the pregnancy with the pragmatic attention she gave to most things, making sensible arrangements, continuing to work as long as she was able, and refusing to be defined by a condition that was temporary even if its consequences were permanent. Their first child was a boy, born in January of 1885, in the bedroom of their house in Albuquerque, with a midwife in attendance and Orville present in a way that was typical of him, steady and close and competent. They named him William after Adelaide's father, and he was a loud, healthy, definitive presence from the moment he arrived, in the way of people who are entirely certain of their right to exist. Adelaide went back to her schoolwork in March, leaving William with a reliable woman named Mrs. Oakes who came in the mornings, and the resumption of her work felt like putting on something that fit correctly after months of something less comfortable. Not that she loved the baby less, but that she was more than the baby, and she had always known this, and it was good to have that confirmed rather than contested. Orville held William at 3 in the morning during the colicky nights of February and March, with a patience that she watched with something that was specifically love in its most grounded and particular form. Not the romantic urgency of the first months, but the deep, daily certainty of a person who is exactly where they chose to be. She told him this one morning in the kitchen in the ordinary light of a Tuesday, while he was making coffee and she was feeding William, who was now 3 months old and enthusiastic about eating. "You know what I realized this morning," she said. "What?" He handed her the coffee without her asking. "I am happy," she said. "I do not mean in a vague, general way. I mean specifically happy, right now." He looked at her over his own cup. The light was ordinary, and the kitchen was untidy from the morning rush, and William was making small authoritative noises, and the day was about to begin with all its routine demands, and he looked at her with those gray eyes that gave everything. "Me too," he said. It was, she thought, a perfect sentence. By 1887, they had established a life in Albuquerque that was full without being busy in the hollow way. Adelaide's second school had grown enough that she had hired 2 additional teachers and was considering a third building. Orville had built a reputation through the territorial marshal's office that was discussed respectfully in official circles, and she gathered from things Drummond said on his visits, in circles that were considerably more official than territorial. There had been conversations about federal positions, about Washington, about things that were larger than New Mexico territory. Their second child came in the autumn of 1887, a girl this time, whom they named Frances, after Orville's mother, and who arrived with the particular composure of a person who is in no hurry and knows it. William was 2.5, and regarded his sister with an initial suspicion that mellowed, over the following months, into a proprietary affection that Adelaide found deeply entertaining. Theodaz Park came for Frances's christening, which he treated as a social occasion of some importance and dressed accordingly. He had continued to practice law in Albuquerque, had built a significant practice, and had become one of Adelaide's genuine friends, which she valued because genuine friends had been something she acquired slowly and held carefully. At the christening dinner, which was held in their house on a Saturday in October with a group of people who had accumulated around them over 4 years in Albuquerque, and who represented, Adelaide reflected, the life she had built from the wreckage of the worst year of her life, Theodaz Park raised a glass and gave a toast. "To Adelaide and Orville," he said, with the slightly formal precision of a man who believes that the right words are always worth finding, who made something out of almost nothing, and who have had the good sense and the considerable courage to keep choosing each other. Adelaide looked at Orville across the table, through the candlelight and the faces of the friends around them and the baby in the arms of Mrs. Oakes in the corner and William asleep on the settee. He was looking back at her, that look, the full one. She raised her glass. By 1889, New Mexico territory was moving toward statehood, a process that was neither swift nor simple but was underway, and Orville had been asked to consider a formal role in the transitional government structures being established. It was the kind of position that came to men who had demonstrated over years that they understood how to build something that worked. He brought it home to Adelaide not as a decision already made, but as a conversation to be had. She read the formal offer from the governor's office over 2 cups of coffee, seated at their kitchen table where so many of the real conversations of their lives had been had, and when she finished reading, she set it down and looked at him. "Do you want it?" she asked. "I want to know what you think," he said, exactly as he had said years ago about the marshal's offer. "That is not the same question," she said, exactly as she had said then. He smiled. The full, real smile. "No," he said, "but they are related," she laughed. "Yes," she said, "do it. It will mean more work, more travel." "Orville," she said, "you have been building towards something like this since you were a young man with idealism and stubbornness who came to New Mexico territory to do something that mattered. It matters. Do it." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers as she had done on horseback that July afternoon years ago. "I will manage everything else." "I always do. We will manage it," he said. "We will manage it," she agreed. William turned 5 that January, and when Adelaide sat with him on the evening of his birthday and he asked her, with the direct curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to package his questions, why she worked at the school every day even when she did not have to, she told him the truth. "Because I love it," she said. "Because those children need someone who thinks about what they need, and I am good at that. And because a person should do what they are good at if they can choose." He thought about this with the gravity of a 5-year-old confronting a philosophical proposition. "Papa does that too," he said. "He does what he is good at." "Yes," Adelaide said, "he does." William nodded, satisfied. "I want to do that when I am grown up," he said. "You will," she said. "You will figure out what you are good at and do it, and it will be something I have not thought of yet." He liked this idea. He went to sleep satisfied. In the summer of 1890, Adelaide sat on the porch of their house in Albuquerque on a warm evening, Frances on her lap and William racing through the garden in pursuit of some domestic adventure, and Orville beside her, his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, Looking at the paper he had been writing on and occasionally reading sentences aloud to her for her opinion, because he trusted her opinion on most things and on words in particular. She thought about February of 1882, about the gun in her hand and the terror, and the cold clarity of finding out that she had been sold. She thought about how far that was from this porch, from this evening, from these children and this man, and this life she had built from what had been taken from her. She had not been offered a life that was easy. She had been offered something harder and therefore more real, the opportunity to build exactly what she needed rather than accepting what someone else had decided she was worth. And she had built it, board by board and page by page and child by child and choice by choice, and the man beside her had stood beside it as promised, not in front of it, not behind it, but exactly alongside. "Adelaide," Orville said. "Orville," she said. "What are you thinking about?" She looked at him. The evening light was kind. William had stopped running and was lying on his back in the garden looking at the sky. Francis had fallen asleep against Adelaide's chest with the total commitment to sleep that small children demonstrate. The town of Albuquerque went about its evening around them. "I am thinking," she said, "about how I could not have imagined this." She gestured, meaning all of it, any of it. "In February of '82, if you had shown me this evening, I would not have believed it was possible." "Does it seem possible now?" he asked. "It seems more than possible," she said. "It seems like exactly what it is." He reached over and tucked a strand of her dark hair back from her face, a small familiar gesture, the kind that accumulates into the architecture of a life together. "I knew what you were capable of the moment you picked up a gun and then put it down and started thinking," he said. "That was the moment I knew." "What did you know?" "That you were going to be all right," he said, "whatever happened. That you were the kind of person who was always going to find a way to be all right." She looked at him steadily. "I was also the kind of person who was always going to need someone to stand beside her while she did it. I just did not know that yet." "I knew," he said. She thought he probably had. That was the thing about Orville Easton. He saw things clearly, and he was patient about what he saw, and he did not hurry people toward conclusions they were not ready for. He had waited, without making her feel waited for, while she found her own way to a truth that had already existed for him. There was no injustice in this. It was simply the particular mathematics of how two specific people had found their way to each other through a dark and difficult year, and had built something luminous on the other side of it. The following spring, in 1891, New Mexico Territory moved another step toward statehood, and Orville's role in the transitional government structure occupied him considerably, and Adelaide opened a third school, this one explicitly designed to serve children from families who had no means to contribute to its running. Funded through a combination of sources she had assembled with the same dogged organizational intelligence she had brought to everything since she was 16 years old and managing her father's accounts. She was 34 years old and she felt completely herself, which was something she had not expected to feel and which she would not have traded for anything simpler. Frances took her first independent steps in March, crossing the kitchen floor from the table to her father's arms with the focused intensity of someone accomplishing a project of enormous importance. William, now 6, applauded with the generosity of an older sibling who has decided, after careful consideration, that his sister is good to have around. Adelaide wrote to her cousin in Denver that spring, the first real letter she had written in years, explaining something of what the intervening time had been. Her cousin wrote back with warmth and honest surprise and a great many questions, and Adelaide answered them all, taking several evenings over the letter, because the story deserved the time it took to tell. The cousin wrote back one more time and said, among other things, that Adelaide sounded like a woman who had built something real, and that this was rare and worth appreciating. Adelaide read this to Orville on a Thursday evening in their kitchen with the windows open to the warm New Mexico spring air, and he listened, and when she finished he said, "She is not wrong." "No," Adelaide said, "she is not." She folded the letter and put it in the box where she kept things worth keeping, and that was where it stayed. There was a morning in the summer of 1892 that Adelaide thought of, years later, as the morning she understood completely what she had. She woke before anyone else, which was not unusual, and lay in the early light listening to the sounds of the house, Frances's occasional murmuring from her room, the movement of the horses in the small stable at the back, the distant sounds of Albuquerque beginning its day. Orville was still asleep beside her, and she could see the particular quality of early light on his face, that unheld, unguarded quality that faces have when the person behind them has stopped managing their expression. She lay there in the summer morning light and felt the weight and warmth of everything she had built and chosen and loved, and she thought that she had stood in the Silver Spur saloon 10 years younger with a gun in her hand and the worst year of her life beginning. And she had chosen, in that moment and in every moment after, not simply to survive it but to walk through it as fully herself as she could manage. And this morning, this particular unremarkable summer morning, was what that looked like. It looked like exactly enough. She got up quietly and went to the kitchen and started the coffee, and stood at the window while it heated and looked at the garden, which had the hollyhocks she had grown from the seeds she had carried from the hollyhocks in redemption, which were themselves grown from seeds she had planted the first spring after the wedding, and which were therefore a kind of continuity, a thread from the worst of it to the best of it, laid out in plants that simply grew because growing was what they did. Orville came into the kitchen 20 minutes later, still not entirely awake, and she handed him coffee without being asked because she had been doing this for 9 years and knew exactly when he needed it and how. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He stood beside her at the window and looked at the garden. "The hollyhocks are doing well this year," he said. "They always do well," she said. "They are very determined." He looked at her with a sideways quality that was fond and amused and entirely the look of a man who knows the person he is looking at thoroughly and finds them, after long acquaintance, even better than advertised. "Yes," he said, "they are." She leaned her head against his shoulder in the morning light, in the ordinary Tuesday of their lives, and felt the particular deep rightness of a life that has been chosen and built and maintained through difficulty and into something that was, by any honest measure, abundantly good. William came in demanding breakfast. Frances followed shortly after, earnest and decisive at 2 years old in the way she would be earnest and decisive her whole life. The morning became what mornings became, full and loud and managed and real. Adelaide moved through it with the ease of a woman who has found the shape of her days and moves inside them without friction, not because it required no effort, but because it required exactly the right kind. And Orville Easton, who had walked into the Silver Spur saloon in February of 1882, knowing already what the letter said, who had stood in doorways and delivered truths and built cases and held hands and cooked beef stew, and rocked a baby at 3 in the morning, and proposed in a schoolhouse and moved cities, and stood beside a woman who was perfectly capable of managing without him, because she had chosen not to. Orville Easton stood in the kitchen of the house they had built together, drank his coffee, watched his children eat, looked at his wife across the ordinary room, and was exactly where he had wanted to be since the moment those gray eyes had given everything, all at once, as they always had, as they always would.